We have learned Auburn's 2026 SEC basketball schedule. Now we break down the key matchups and how the Tigers can defend their SEC crown. Welcome into this edition of the Barn Hoops Podcast. I am your host, Jacob Hillman, and today we are going to break down the 2026 SEC basketball schedule for the Auburn Tigers, as well as the rest of the conference, and what it means for Auburn and how the Tigers can get back to their winning ways and potentially defend that SEC regular season championship. Thanks for tuning in again to this episode. As I was off last week, then maybe that's what I have to do for news like this to drop some exciting news with the SEC schedule release. Obviously, we're still waiting for that non-conference schedule to drop for the Auburn Tigers. We got the official announcement of that Auburn-Houston game that will take place on November 16th in Birmingham, but still waiting for a lot of pieces to be finalized and released from the athletic department, and we'll be so excited to see that and break that down as well. But for now, we're going to talk about conference play, and that's obviously in the SEC that sent 14 teams to the NCAA tournament last year, the most ever by a single conference, and it's going to be as strong as ever this year. A lot of newcomers, a lot of teams are going to look different, but that's because of how strong it was last year. Lots of transfers in from high major programs, a lot of high production joining teams in the SEC. But once again, thanks for tuning in to the Barn Hoops Podcast. And reminder, you can sign up now for $25 off your annual subscription at thebarnauburn.com. Be sure to like, subscribe, and interact here on the Barn Auburn YouTube channel, as well as wherever you listen to your podcasts. Again, we march towards football season. Last night was the start of the athletic year with Auburn soccer getting underway. James Armstrong's squad fell in a close win to Louisville, so we're here now. First day of class is on Monday for all the Auburn students and student athletes. So it is about that time as we march closer to the football season as well as the basketball season, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And really starting off with just what the schedule looks like. So I'll bring it up just for a refresher. I'm sure most of you have seen this, have broken it down and thought to yourself, what record can Auburn finish with here? How can Auburn finish in the top of the SEC once again? And obviously, it is something that it's difficult to repeat in this sport, especially with how strong the SEC is at this point. I wouldn't be shocked if the SEC, we talked about it in the last episode a couple of weeks ago, Joe Lunardi expects another record number of SEC teams in the NCAA tournament. It's very possible that it does happen again. And we'll learn more about some of these teams and the specifics for them, the rotations, and really what to expect from them after the first month and a half. You got to get through Fee Suite before you can really understand just what these teams' styles are going to be like and what the rotations are going to look like. So for now, we're guessing a little bit, but overall, I do think it is you can kind of understand that all these teams are looking pretty much brand new. Auburn, obviously, probably the newest looking team with the only Tahaad Pettiford returning from the Final Four this past season. Other teams have, several newcomers as well, but maybe not the key returnee that Auburn does in Tahaad Pettiford. So as we break down this schedule, let's talk about a hot start and how important that would be for Auburn in the season. I guess first, just kind of running through the schedule, you have two cases of two road games in a row. That's when you go to Ole Miss either January 20th or 21st, and then you go to the defending national champions, Florida, where you haven't won in quite some time. And then on February 14th, you go to Arkansas before the midweek slate at the Hump against Mississippi State. So, two of your toughest matchups are in back-to-back road games. And that's something that we're going to talk about a little bit. I wouldn't consider either Florida or even in Mississippi State on the road, obviously a trap game, but we'll discuss some of those possible ones as we move along here. But why I note a hot start is being the key to 2026, and especially if you want to defend the SEC title. You look at last year, Auburn didn't lose a conference game until the Florida game on February 8th or 9th, whenever that game was. But you're right in the thick of things by the time that date rolls around. And Auburn hasn't lost an SEC game. It was pretty, because of how good the SEC was, there was one of two ways it was going. Either the SEC was cannibalizing itself and Auburn was going to run away with it, or you can't feel comfortable at all because there's a team right there on your heels. But it was the former, as Auburn wrapped up the SEC title with a week to spare. I can't say I expect that to happen again this year, as Auburn was the best team in the country from November all the way through March this past season. So looking at let's look at the first 6 games of the schedule leading into that Florida road game and what Auburn faces in these first 6 games. So it's 3 home games, 3 road games. You start off the year at Georgia, which is kind of wild because, again, this is a game that is not going to be played twice. So Auburn's going to go to Georgia, and that's it. There will be no return trip from the Bulldogs in the 2026 season, as they're having to shake things up a little bit to rotate home and home opponents. So Auburn's obviously going to get it's Arkansas home and away this year. And that wouldn't be able to happen as Alabama and Ole Miss are kind of those permanent home opponents. So Georgia is the one that comes off. So you go to Georgia January 3rd. Right now, projected as some of the last teams in. So they're towards the bottom of the SEC in that 11 to 12 range. And then you host Texas A&M, who will be breaking in a brand new head coach in Bucky McMillan. It'll only be his second SEC game as the Aggies head coach. And in the first game for the Aggies, they will be hosting LSU. So that's probably the best way to get comfortable. You face one of the 2 bottom feeders of the SEC at this point. LSU or South Carolina are obviously those 2 teams. But it's still going to be difficult for a Texas A&M team with a brand new head coach, looking brand new, to come into Neville Arena and win a game like that. Obviously a place where it is so tough to win. And then Auburn hosts another game, and this one is against Arkansas. This is a big one. I think that this is probably the key game in this stretch that you really just need to win because, again, as we get into it, you go to Missouri January 13th through 14th. You host South Carolina on January 17th. And then before that trip to the defending national champions for a Final Four rematch, you go to Oxford, Mississippi to face Ole Miss on January 20th or 21st. None of those teams, with the exception of Arkansas, are really expected to be in that top tier of the SEC. Of course, you could see an underrated team like South Carolina a couple of years ago come out of nowhere and finish in the top 4 of the SEC. But at this point, that is not expected. And I think that Auburn will be in a position with a tough non-conference schedule that it will feel good about where it's at. Now, obviously, who knows what happens in the non-conference schedule, especially because it's such a tough non-conference schedule. Is it a lack of confidence? Is there some gelling issues? Who knows? We'll see. But I would expect more of what we saw last year. Not that Auburn's going to be the best team in the country for 4 months of the season, but I do think that team last year, you watched it as that Houston game happened. You saw the spark in the second half after trailing. And then in Maui, the way the team dominated. Then you move on to the next week where Auburn loses to Duke, but puts up a heck of a fight and even led for the first part of that game. And then obviously you go and dominate Ohio State and Purdue. And it really is just easy going towards the end of that non-conference slate. Even when Janai Baroum has that injury that he was trying to recover from, he injures himself again against South Carolina in the SEC slate, and that team just continued to get better. And that was obvious from that Houston game in early November all the way through February. And then obviously you got to the tournament where anything can happen, and you face the ultimate national champions, and Florida just played better. But I think when you look at these first 6 games, you are facing a Georgia team that is a total wild card, quite frankly. They could finish 12th, 13th, or 14th in the SEC. I think that LSU and South Carolina will for sure finish in 15th and 16th. Above that, who knows? But I think Georgia very well could finish right above those bottom feeders. Texas A&M is breaking in a new head coach, Bucky McMillan. He's a young guy. He's been at Samford the last few years, so he hasn't even coached at this high Division I level. He was in high school in Birmingham prior to that. And then you do get Arkansas at home, John Calipari in his second season with a team that I think definitely can finish in the top 6 of the SEC. You go to Missouri, Dennis Gates, obviously a great season last year after just a horrendous 2023 season or 2024 season where the Tigers didn't win an SEC game. And then you host South Carolina, who obviously, again, like I said, probably not going to be contending for any tournament consideration next season. And then you go to Ole Miss, who, I feel like Chris Beard, this is the time for him and his staff to make that jump as a program and into the top half of the SEC. And if he doesn't, I don't know what's going to happen there in Oxford. This 6 games, so this is the first third of your schedule. Those 6 games, you're not going to be, Ole Miss might be the game that you're an underdog in. That's really it. Unless a Georgia or Missouri just come out of the gates hot in November and December and Auburn might sputter a little bit, you're going to be favored in those home games. And Georgia and Missouri, I wouldn't expect to have a ton of, firepower at this point in the season. They could come together and end up being a top 10, top 8 SEC team. But at this point in the season, I just don't think that will be the case. So what are you looking for? I think you're looking to obviously win all of your home games. That's the goal every single year in every single home game. But is it 1 out of 3? Is it 2 out of 3? Is it all 3 of these road games? If you want to win the SEC, I think you got to win all 3. But really, we're looking at it like this. You're going to want to finish in the top 4 of the SEC. That is the ultimate goal for that SEC slate. Obviously, it is an SEC championship, but what you want to be aiming for is that top 4, because if you do that, you're going to be a top 4 or 3 seed in the NCAA tournament and have a chance to make a run. That Georgia game, obviously, if you win that one, then chances are you can start 3-0 in the SEC, going to Missouri, who, like I said, 2 years ago was one of the worst teams we've ever seen in the SEC. And then last year bounced back a little bit and had some success under Dennis Gates. And then you host South Carolina, who finished last in the SEC last year. And then you go to Ole Miss, which I think is the toughest game in that slate. Arkansas is a good team, but it's just Neville Arena is that much of a difference maker. So I think if you're 5-1 going into Gainesville, going into the O-Dome, then that game just becomes that much more important as you make a case for an SEC title. In that case, you would need to go and beat Florida for the first time in however long it's been. I don't even want to think about how long it's been. It's similar to the Kentucky streak as well as the LSU Death Valley football streak it was. So if you can go into Gainesville and win that game, then all bets are off. Who knows what's going to happen in the SEC? There's probably going to be a lot of chaos. But I just think a 5-1 or 6-0 start to the SEC slate is exactly what Auburn would need to really contend for the SEC. And at the very least, be in contention for a top 4 seed in Nashville when it's all said and done. Now, I talked about this stretch is a little bit easy. The middle stretch is not. These are the middle 6 games. So like I mentioned, you're going to Florida on January 24th, right before you host Texas for the first time in Neville Arena as an SEC member, maybe for the first time ever, I'm not sure. And then you go to Tennessee, January 31st in Knoxville. I think that Texas game is the ultimate trap game between a Florida and a Tennessee. Do I know what's, Texas has obviously got a new head coach as well, Sean Miller, coming from Xavier. What does Texas look like? I don't know. So if they're not a very good team, then I think that game's a little bit more, there's a little bit less pressure on it, and you're able to go in and handle business being at home. But Texas is kind of that tough, gritty team that we've seen in past years. And, whether it's coming off a bad loss to Florida or a huge win over Florida, you might be looking ahead to Tennessee a little bit just because, going to Knoxville is always a big deal for Auburn and Coach Pearl. So that Texas game is very important. So after the Tennessee game on January 31st is an open date. So obviously with the way the schedule shakes out, every team gets an open date in the midweek at some point in the schedule. I think Auburn's falls in a perfect place as it's after the Tennessee game and before you host Alabama on February 7th. And then you host Vanderbilt on February 10th or 11th before you go to Arkansas to close out that season series in Fayetteville. This stretch is not easy by any stretch of the imagination. You look at the home games, like I said, I think Texas is a trap game, and then Alabama is obviously going to be in that SEC title contention as it has been over the last few years. And then, Vanderbilt. I mean, you look at some of the games they won last year, you can't count them out. That's obviously going to be the easiest of that 6-game stretch because, if you told me today that Florida, Tennessee, and Arkansas all 3 beat Auburn in their home gyms, that I could see that happening. That's a strong possibility. But again, I do think that your key here is that you have your open date between that Tennessee and Alabama matchup between January 31st and February 7th. That's going to really reset this team after one. Like I said, hopefully you're in a spot where you started the SEC slate off right, 5-1, 6-0. Then, who knows what happens on the road between Florida and Tennessee. If you go 0-2 there, if you're 6-3, that's a great place to reset, and you can come down the stretch in a strong way. You would have to go and beat Arkansas at Arkansas, but then your toughest road game is just at Alabama to close out the season. So I think that's where your key is. If you are 6-3 going into that Alabama game, then you are in a spot where the next 3 games are so critical to the SEC title race. Last year, Auburn won the SEC title with the 16-2 record. Someone could come out and have a great season like that. And, if that's the case, then you've got to be on top of your game. And there's just nothing you can do about stopping just a powerhouse like that. It was actually 15-3 Auburn won the title at, but again, it was with a week to spare. But I just continue to look at this middle part of the schedule. Florida, Tennessee, Arkansas on the road. I think Tennessee is going to be down a little bit just from years past. And I don't think it means it's going to be a bad team, but Tennessee won't be its usual self. Just trying to figure things out after some of your veterans have left, Zakai Ziegler being namely one of them. You don't have a Dalton Connect like you did 2 years ago. But I don't think that means Tennessee is not going to be easy to win in Knoxville, that's for sure. But as it relates to a Florida and Arkansas, obviously Florida's the defending national champions. You just lost to them twice last year, once in the Final Four. And then Arkansas, you handle business against the Razorbacks in the regular season, but John Calipari, it looked like he figured some things out in the NCAA tournament before ultimately falling to Texas Tech in the Sweet 16. I just think that this Arkansas team is ready to take that jump, and that's going to be a tough game at Bud Walton Arena. That place will be rocking, especially considering the last time Auburn was in Bud Walton Arena, it beat Arkansas in historic fashion. It was the largest margin of defeat for the Razorbacks in that building's history. So that's something that I know those fans will remember. I guess probably not most of the team because it's pretty much a brand new team and they weren't around for that. But nonetheless, that's a big deal. That's going to be a talking point, I'm sure, for Coach Calipari and staff. All right, looking at the final 6. You go to Mississippi State on February 17th and 18th. Then you host Kentucky on February 21st. You go to Oklahoma on February 24th or 25th. You host Ole Miss on February 28th. You host LSU for senior night on March 3rd or 4th. And then you go to Alabama, Coleman Coliseum on March 7th to close out the season. And this is as intended. This is how it should be. Auburn hosted Alabama to close the season last year. Now Auburn's going to go to Alabama to close the season next year. And hopefully in 2027, the Crimson Tide make their return trip for the season finale to Neville Arena. And then it goes back and forth from there for the rest of the time, because that's exactly how it should be. And the SEC sort of did that with its schedule this year. If you go to that last Saturday of the season, that's March 7th, 2026, Oklahoma visits Texas. Vanderbilt visits Tennessee. And then Texas A&M at LSU has become a bit of a rivalry as well, just with some of the football history. You remember that 7 overtime game a few years back, but that's become its rivalry in its own right. And then you have Florida at Kentucky, which is a great basketball rivalry. They were the two teams for a while that were holding the SEC together, quite frankly. So it's good to see games like that taking place on the final Saturday of the season. Outside of that, South Carolina visits Ole Miss, and then Georgia visits Mississippi State, and Arkansas visits Missouri. That's an underrated game as well for the final Saturday of the season. So really, you're looking at these last 6 games for Auburn. And as I said, if you're 6-3 after the Tennessee game, let's say you go 2-1 against Alabama, Vanderbilt, and Arkansas. So you lose that Arkansas game. You are 8-4 going into the last 6 games. At that point, your SEC title shots might be over, just depending on the landscape of the SEC. But who knows? There's been years where 13-5 has won the league. My point that with saying that is that Auburn could easily win its last 6 games of the year. Now, I say easily. That's easier said than done as well. I just don't think that going to Mississippi State is that scary at this point. I don't think going to Oklahoma is scary at all. And then obviously you have your toughest matchup, or one of your toughest matchups in Kentucky coming to Neville Arena. That's a revenge game for Auburn. Obviously, the last time the Wildcats were in Neville Arena, Auburn couldn't really get its offense going, and Kentucky won in easy fashion. And then obviously you have the game in Alabama on March 7th. But if you look at that Mississippi State, Oklahoma, Ole Miss, LSU game, I look at those as you need to chalk them up as W's if you're going to want to win the SEC title. And quite frankly, Kentucky and Alabama might need to be that way as well if you start your first 12 games the way I just mentioned. So, again, I think this schedule breaks down pretty well for Auburn. That middle stretch is really difficult. It's a good thing Auburn has its open date right smack dab in the middle. But I just think that this team is we're going to have to learn so much about this team and how it really comes together and finds its rhythm, finds its chemistry. And if it's ready for January 3rd at Georgia, then you really don't know what can happen. This team could go 15-3 like the 2025 team did. You don't know. But, I think you got to look at more of a realistic record of being happy with 13-5. You're 13-5, you're top 4 in the SEC. And that's all you can ask, quite frankly. And in such a parity-driven league where college basketball in general, not just the SEC, if you win half of your road games, you win all of your home games, you had a successful conference season. That's the way to look at it. That's going to get you a top 4 seed in the NCAA tournament, and that's how you make runs to the Final Four. That's how you get to the second weekend of March Madness. So, again, I think when you look at this and you start to break down how Auburn can get back to that title contention, it's going to start with, again, a hot start, and then you got to manage that middle part of the season. And if you do that, then you're going to be confident going into late February against games like Kentucky. And then on the road to Alabama, you just won there last year. You're going to feel confident going into that. And that place will be wild. But again, it's just last game of the season. Who knows what these teams are going to, is Auburn locked into its seeding in Nashville? Does it really feel good about where it's at? Same with Alabama. That changes the dynamic of that game. And you talk about that last year with how that game in Neville Arena against the Crimson Tide went and how the game in College Station went for Auburn against Texas A&M without Denver Jones coming off the clinch of the SEC title. Auburn didn't have a ton to play for at that point. Obviously, that's something that the team won't say, the coaches won't say, but in reality, that's how you feel as a fan, is that, all right, the SEC title is wrapped up. Let's see what momentum you can build going into it. And that's the most you're trying to play for. So, speaking of that, let's talk about trap games and who I think are some of the biggest ones on this schedule for next year. Last year, that Texas A&M game was a straight schedule loss. Quite frankly, I think if Auburn has not clinched the SEC title or isn't in, I guess it depends. But if you haven't clinched the SEC title, if Auburn needed that A&M game to clinch the SEC title, I think it is played completely differently. And I think that potentially Auburn comes out on top. I'm not saying that Auburn 100% wins that game if it's not going off the Kentucky game, but I know it goes differently. That's the only thing I'll say. So for this upcoming year, what does it look like? Doesn't have to be a road game either. I think there's a home game here, and I said it already. That could be really, really tricky for the Tigers. So I do think those first 6 games, I think you're locked in. There's not really a trap game in there for Auburn. Maybe Ole Miss before you go to Florida, but that's going to be your first really tough road test, and it's a 2-game road trip. That team will be locked in. So that brings me to my first potential trap game, and that's the Texas game on January 27th and 28th sandwiched between Florida and Tennessee on the road. Coming off a road trip, and then you're about to have to get back on the road for another tough test. that Texas game, especially if Sean Miller has that team rolling, could be a tough one. So I look at that Texas game, and then the next one I'll look at is its fellow rival, its Red River rival, and new member of the SEC, Oklahoma, on February 24th or 25th. So that one's between two home games. So that's a road game. This one's more similar to the A&M game last year, where you're going to Oklahoma for one game. It's your last time getting on an airplane for the regular season after a Kentucky game before the second game of the Ole Miss series of the season. So I just think that, again, if Ole Miss is a good team this year, I kind of think this is the year they have to make the jump, then it's sandwiched right between two of the best teams in the league in Kentucky and potentially Ole Miss. And I just think that that Oklahoma game can get a little bit tricky if you're not careful for the Tigers. Another underrated one, I just don't think LSU is going to have the heart at this point. I don't think LSU will be in contention enough at this point. But that senior night matchup is with Alabama looming on the road, that could be for an SEC title. Who knows? That could be for major implications. It could be for the double bye in Nashville, whatever it may be. I think I look back to the 2020 season, right before COVID derailed everything and ended that season. That loss to Texas A&M at home on senior night before Auburn went and demolished Tennessee. I don't know. That's a game that I would keep an eye on, and just if LSU is not better than expected, then this probably isn't a factor, but you never know. So those are kind of my three trap games. I'm looking at that Texas game in late January, Oklahoma in late February, and then the home finale against LSU as some of those games that you kind of chalk up as a win, but then the time rolls around and you're looking around, there's 4 minutes to go and you're down 8 points. That's, that's something to look out for. And then we look at the home matchups and what I think some of the most exciting games to come to Neville Arena. And these are going to be pretty obvious. Obviously, the Alabama matchup, that's something that Auburn will be looking for revenge after last year's loss in overtime to the Crimson Tide. But my other three are, one, obvious again, Kentucky. Another revenge game as the Wildcats took down the Tigers 2 years ago inside Neville Arena when College Game Day was in town. All the students camped out to get into the game. And I just think this Kentucky team, with Mark Pope and Otega Owe returning, they're also in that spot to take the next step and potentially be that maybe a Final Four team this year. Who knows? We'll see. And then I'm looking at Arkansas on January 10th. That's your first major home matchup. And again, it's John Calipari. That's always going to bring the energy. And of course, he and Coach Pearl's history goes way back. And obviously they love to rib each other and go at each other against each other. So the other one, just because, again, it's the first time Texas will be visiting Auburn in Neville Arena as an SEC opponent. That's going to be a cool one. Sean Miller goes to Texas after leaving Xavier, and the Longhorns firing of Rodney Terry. I just think that, again, that one's also coming off 2 straight road games against Ole Miss and Florida. If you go and defeat the national champions or the defending national champions, and like I said, what if you're 7-0 coming back for the Longhorns? That place is going to be rocking. So those are the home games I'm really looking forward to in 2026 on the SEC schedule. But this whole schedule is very exciting. Road games at Florida and Tennessee. I've been to both of those places, and they're awesome places to watch basketball games. The O-Dome is epic. Thompson Bowling is pretty big, but outside of that, it's a great place to watch a game. I'd love to get up to Bud Walton on Valentine's Day for a game. I feel like that would be a great atmosphere to watch a game. And then obviously you look at that season finale at Alabama in Coleman Coliseum. After what happened last year, I won't miss that one. I will be there for that one, for that season finale. So excited for that. Interesting note also, just looking at the schedule again, 1 month exactly between that February matchup at home against Alabama and the season finale in Coleman Coliseum. So this schedule is gonna really shake out to be a good one. And I think that Auburn has a chance again to contend for the SEC title. And if not, definitely for a top 4 seed in the SEC. It's going to take a hot start, though, for the Tigers in 2026. But that's going to do it for this edition of the Barn Hoops podcast as we charge along this summer with the SEC schedule coming out. Hopefully that non-conference schedule isn't too far behind. As I mentioned, the Houston game date has officially been announced. That will take place on November 16th in Birmingham at Legacy Arena at the BJCC. That's football's bye week. So even if you're in Auburn, hike it up to Birmingham and support the Tigers against the Cougars and what will be the first major matchup of the season for Auburn against potentially the number one team in the country. Who knows? Auburn's future opponent in Indianapolis might be the number one team in the preseason poll in Purdue. But regardless, I think Houston is the top 2 team in the country, and that's going to be a epic game at Legacy Arena at the BJCC. So eventually that non-conference schedule is going to come out, and we're going to break it down similarly to what we just did here, similar exercise, and kind of look at the record. How can Auburn build the most momentum going into the SEC slate against those teams? Probably not expecting Auburn to win every single game outside of the road game to Duke this time around. So excited for it. Getting ready for the athletic year to ramp back up as like I said, soccer started last night. So that means fall camp is well into session, and Top Button podcast with Charlie 5, aka Kyle Rush, as well as Village Vice with Brad Law and Zach Blackerby, have you all covered, all fall camp, all regular season, every football game covered right here on the Barn Auburn Podcast Network. So remember to hit that subscribe button wherever you're listening to your podcast or on the YouTube channel. Hit the like button, and I want you to comment the game you're most excited for in this 2026 SEC slate. Is it that home potential revenge game against Alabama or Kentucky? Is it going on the road to have a chance to beat Florida in the O-Dome? Let me know in the comments below as we continue to march towards that first November game and Neville Arena, and so excited for it as we get ready for the first day of classes for the Tigers here on the Plains. So thank you again for tuning in to the Barn Hoops Podcast. I'm Jacob Hillman saying so long until next time on the Barn Auburn Network.